Hello and good morning. My name is Amy White. Today I will be discussing the story of the post-war American experience, U.S. manufacturing industry, and ordinary citizens. Throughout the years of the world wars, the global economy that we know today indeed emerged with all its intricate moving pieces, growing and establishing new centers of business, production, and marketplaces to sell these commodities. By the end of the world wars, the United States had become a proverbial powerhouse of production and manufacturing. Growing up, my siblings and cousins and I listened to countless hours of my grandparents' stories about this period. My grandfather, Bascom Roberts, was born on February the 19th, 1924, in Louisa, Kentucky. Just over a year later, my grandmother, Kathleen V. Strutt, was born on February the 24th, 1925. Both grew up under similar circumstances, coming of age during the Great Depression and doing their part to help in the U.S. war effort during World War II. My grandfather was drafted into the United States Army, serving as a military police in the Pacific Northwest, primarily the Alaskan Territory. For my grandmother, the war years were a bit different. She had just graduated high school, and both her parents had passed away within the past 2 years, and all her siblings and her decided to move away from their country home in Pike County, Ohio, north to the city of Springfield to find work. During this time, manufacturing in the United States was steadily growing. The U.S. government was flooding large amounts of federal military spending to manufacturers throughout the U.S., including a small tubing company, Alloy Tubing Company, in Springfield, Ohio, where my grandmother began working in 1944. The result of the manufacturing jobs led to a great deal of expansion and commerce throughout the country, creating thriving communities and community growth during the war years. During the war years, the U.S. experienced the largest rise and fall in military spending in its history, eventually peaking in 1944 when military spending accounted for over 35% of the GDP, and then dropping to just 5% of the GDP by 1950. The result was a tremendous growth in jobs and manufactured goods, primarily to support the war effort. Workers like my grandmother, Kathleen, arrived in the cities to fill positions in the industry. Kathleen lived in southern Ohio, a rural area surrounded by a sparse yet tight-knit community, but with very few jobs beyond agriculture, especially for young women. From my grandmother's journals, there is a lot to be gathered. After selling everything down home, they moved up to the city, and when they arrived in Springfield, they all got the mumps, all of her sisters and her. After about a month, she started looking for work. She went to the Alloy Tubing Company, owned by the International Harvester Company, and worked there for 2 years. In her journal, she stated the following. She said, "I loved working there. It was hard work, but I loved it. I had a lot of friends. My best friend was Betty Sager. She lived out in the country with her grandmother, and she would stay with us a lot, and we would go have fun running around town in Springfield. Those 2 years were so much fun. I guess because I was my own boss and could do what I wanted to do." The independence this manufacturing job gave to Kathleen, like other women of the period, allowed her to have financial security of her own. At the Alloy Tubing Company, they manufactured ammunition casing, shells, and different sizes of tubes. For a young woman from the country who had never really worked before, this job was liberating. Her father had worked during the Great Depression for sometimes just a quarter a day, And now, during the war, she was able to work in a manufacturing industry that, on average, provided a weekly wage of $31.21. For women employees, shortly after the war, my grandfather Henry returned home to Kentucky. He came up to Springfield, Ohio to visit family. His cousin just happened to live next door to Kathleen and her sisters and made it a point to introduce Henry to Kathleen. Not too long after, they were courting, and eventually they married and began a family. After the war, the infrastructure and precedence of American manufacturing factories remained a vital aspect of the U.S. economy, leading to further expansion and development and production throughout the country, primarily serving as employment opportunities for returning GIs. Eventually, Henry heard about a new automotive plant through General Motors in Columbus, Ohio. He went out to Columbus and was accepted into a position. They then moved from Springfield to Columbus. Kathleen now stayed at home as a stay-at-home mom, taking care of the house and the children. What is so important about this period is the tremendous amount of growth experienced in the U.S. economy during and after World War II. After the war, families like mine, who had virtually nothing following the years of the Great Depression, were now able to seek work in factories, earning significant incomes and growing communities. Production companies created during the war years began expanding on their own infrastructure. The manufacturing industry also went through a transformation of sorts. Instead of one factory gathering exclusive products, firms began focusing on private sector production. By the end of the 1940s, the price controls and rationing of the war years had ended. Black alley transactions were needless, and the public market was essentially reopened. With the market wide open, people began spending their savings and investing in the future. My grandparents moved to Columbus, Ohio, and bought their own home for the first time. Henry went back to school and technical trades on the GI Bill, and the U.S. economy continued to soar in the years after the war. Production was up, and the quantity of resources America had enabled the U.S. to become the world's leading supplier in virtually every industrial raw material. The U.S. was able to tap into labor during the war and post-war period and into its efficient business management and the acquisition of raw materials, thus creating a store of potential for the country and for the people. My grandfather, Henry Roberts, worked at General Motors for 30 years and was married to Grandma for 58 years. They had 4 children, 12 grandchildren, and so far 16 great-grandchildren and 1 great-grandchild. Thank you so much for listening. If you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you. Hope you have a great day. Thanks.